Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining our webinar today, Superpowering Human Performance with Augmented Reality, hosted by Atheer and the 70-20-10 Institute. We have quite a few folks who are joining us today, but we also have a pretty full agenda, a lot to cover. So we'll go ahead and get started. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded, so hopefully you will have a chance to share the recording link with your friends and colleagues who are unable to join us today. Also, this will be an interactive session. We will have a couple of polls where we will enable you to provide some insights and answers to those polls. And also throughout the course of the webinar today, we will be taking Q&A in chat, which will be tracked by Jeff Wheelwright, my colleague, and we'll be holding the Q&A until the very end. Today's webinar agenda, we will be covering a few different items around the role of augmented reality and learning and development in the organization. We will be starting with talking about continuous learning, real performance insight, and then we'll be transitioning to the why and the what of AR at work. And then we'll be talking about the many opportunities of applying augmented reality in learning and development in the enterprise. And then we'll be going through a successful journey of how to deploy AR in learning and development. Then we'll be wrapping up and opening the floor for Q&A. But first, our experts today will be hearing from Charles Jennings of the 70-20-10 Institute, which he co-founded. Charles has been working in the area of learning and performance innovation for 40 years. Initially as an academic and business school professor, he's been in for the past 25 years, as well as in senior industry and commercial roles, and has been driving initiatives forward with the 70-20-10 Institute, which he will talk more about today. Alongside Charles, we'll be hearing from Petter Andersson. Petter is Atheer's VP of Professional Services and has more than 20 years of large enterprise experience in numerous business consulting in HR executive roles for companies such as IBM, Ericsson, and Hitachi. At Ericsson, in fact, he was Chief Learning Officer for the group for more than 6 years, serving more than 100,000 employees. And myself, I'm not an expert. I'm the moderator today. My name is Rika Nakazawa. I'm VP of Partnerships at Atheer. You will see on the screen also the Twitter handle for our experts today. So please feel free to tweet out over the course of the webinar. So what we will do to kick things off, we'd love to first hear from the audience. We have quite a number of folks in the webinar, and we know that a lot of you have either been dwelling in the space as it relates to learning and development, or have been working in the space of AR, and we'd really love to just get a snapshot as to where you are around this. So you should be able to see a poll feature in the GoToWebinar. If you could take just the next 10 to 20 seconds to reply to the question, what role do you have in looking at AR and learning and performance? So either you're helping the organization to learn and perform using augmented reality, or perhaps you're helping other organizations leverage AR in learning and performance, or you may be an AR technology player today in some capacity, or perhaps you're just curious and here to learn more as you've been hearing more and more about augmented reality and impacts on human performance or other. So if you could just take a quick few seconds and reply to that poll, and we'll be revealing the poll results in a moment. And then we will be able to move on to Charles Jennings and his section. Okay, so organizer Jeff, hopefully we have the poll results now. All right, okay, great. So it looks like the majority of the folks who are on the webinar today are helping the organizations, or helping other organizations learn and perform using augmented reality, which is great. Followed by folks on the call being a technology player in AR, and then folks who are here curious and to learn. and then helping the organizations themselves to learn and perform using AR, and then other folks, which we might circle back with you towards the end and perhaps learn what other areas folks are dwelling in. Okay, so let me go ahead and turn it over to Charles Jennings to talk about continuous learning, real performance insight. Charles, please take it away.
Thanks very much, Rika. Jeff, if we can just get the screen back, that'd be great. Thank you. Oops. Thanks. If you can just move it on to the next slide, that's great. So thanks very much, Rika. Thanks, Jeff. I think, sorry, Jeff, can you take it back to that first slide? That's it. Thank you. I think the title of this webcast says it all, really. It's about superpowering human performance. And at last, we're seeing organizations around the world grasp the notion that learning is just one way towards a common goal of high performance and increased productivity. And there's no doubt we need to look beyond traditional training if we're going to build high-performing organizations and move forward from that. But I want to look at some of the drivers as we start out. And over the past 50 or 60 years, despite all our best efforts, all the work that's been carried out in training and development, it hasn't really hit home in terms of significantly lifting performance and productivity. And if the Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman, who's quoted here, is to be believed, and there's every reason to believe him, productivity may not be everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. So I think we're moving to a point where we're looking at performance and productivity and mapping out the routes and journeys as to how we get there, rather than spending our lives focused on learning and development and training. And I think that's a big change that we're seeing happening. The graph on the top here comes from the OECD data. It shows one of the big challenges that we face, because despite all the work on improving work processes, all the lean and agile work, all the training and development of new infrastructure, all the new technologies over the past 28 years, overall, the rate of workforce productivity uplift across the developed world has remained about the same. These figures cover the USA, the original 15 countries in the European Union, and Japan. But if we look across all developed economies, we see exactly the same trend. Labor productivity rates are increasing just about 1% per year. And if we look further back from 1990 here, if we go back another 30 years, the picture is actually even more depressing. So there's some outliers. Some developing countries, such as China, do have higher increases in labor productivity, and China's rate's been about 6% per annum, although it's dropping a bit now as China develops more. So one of the challenges we've got is, what can we do with new approaches and new technologies to lift this productivity rate? We hear our political masters all the time talking about, the great push for greater productivity and so on, but looking at historical data, it hasn't been lifting a lot. So there's also a series of disruption drivers at play, and we all know about this. We all know about the VUCA, the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. It's a concept or term that came out of the US Army War College in the late 1980s. And there's no doubt that all of us are having to deal with greater levels of each of these than people before us had faced, and even more than we faced ourselves just 15 or 20 years ago. And McKinsey's report, published just 9 months ago at the end of last year, is a window into one aspect of that challenge. By 2030, which sounds a long way, but it's only 11 and a bit years away, McKinsey in this report say that 14% of the global workforce is likely to need to switch occupation. Now, McKinsey took a very conservative view of its data. And when you look at the data, this figure could be significantly greater, into billions of workers. So there's a major disruption driver occurring here, as well as the imperative for productivity. And AR, I feel, fits into this way in which we can plug some holes in some of these drivers. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. One of the key drivers, or sets of drivers relate to performance. And in the past, training and learning have been separated. We would interrupt work in order to learn, whether it's to go on a course or attend a workshop or work through an e-learning module or whatever it happened to be. But learning and working were essentially separated. And this model has its origins in the 20th century, actually even earlier. The concept, for example, of curriculum or a learning pathway, which we still use, was a late 18th century, early 19th century construct developed in Prussia for military training, which followed on a defeat by the French of the Prussian army, and the Prussians decided that a bit more was needed beyond drills and forming up in line and marching in step. So they created this idea of the curriculum, which was picked up in the early 19th century by American educators, and we're left with the structured education model for what is now our 21st century dynamic needs. And it doesn't really mesh too well. There's some other drivers in this 20th century approach with things such as standardization, something that came with mass worker education after the Second World War, and the idea of best practices. And we often hear that term used, but organizations are dealing with such complexity nowadays that best practices are pretty well meaningless if we think we can just observe what's done to develop human performance in another company and then apply it to our own and get the same results. We're kidding ourselves, we know that. We can talk about good practices that we can learn from and emerging practices and so on, but the idea of best practices we're sort of moved away from. Most of us are also still trapped in what I call the competency cage rather than the capability springboard. Competencies about proving what people can do now, capabilities are what our potentials are. So we've got this opportunity in terms of looking at performance in a different way, thinking about how we can bring learning and work together. And Petra, I'd just like to ask, from your time with Andersson, what are your experiences with this journey towards supporting continuous learning and learning as part of the workflow?
All right. Hi, Charles, and thanks for the question, and hi, everyone. I agree with what you say, and I, having seen this shift from within over the years, when less people tend to show up for classroom events, and we hear more and more that people simply don't have the time to learn. So we've been forced to push for mindset shift, raising the awareness of how and where learning really happens. So at Andersson, we launched a theme called Everyday Learning, and we moved towards more bite-sized learning, towards continuous coaching and collaboration. And what is funny is that we reached a point where we said, we don't need to count training days anymore. There is no benefit of it aside from the resource management aspect. It's not an indirect measure of success and could even be misleading in a way. So, but we just didn't realize the legacy of these measures, because both the unions and even the National Statistical Bureau of Sweden was asking every year, what's the budget and average number of training days per employee that you deliver to hold us accountable for employee development. And the unions, for example, were very suspicious that we just wanted to drive down cost for learning. And as we transformed our approach, we had to stand up against many of those legacies and educate our stakeholders. And as we continued, we were able to demonstrate to them and show a strong uptake in both learning satisfaction as well as in business impact. But if we fast forward to today, I would say, we can see by the current workforce being even more eager to join exciting and fulfilling project and stretch assignment than to attend training programs. I think that's yet another validation of what you just talked about, Charles.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, I think we've got these legacy metrics which have been driving measuring activity rather than measuring output. That's one of the key challenges that we do face. Can we just have the next slide, please? Because a final point I'd like to make is to reinforce this inflection point. And at the 70-20-10 Institute, we're continually working with organizations to flip our thinking. In one way, to flip our thinking from learning in order to work, which is very much rooted in the learning paradigm to thinking about how we can work in order to learn, and how can we learn from our work. In other words, we're embedded in this performance paradigm. And my colleague Jos Arets, I think, says this very well. He says, learning is the intelligent byproduct of continuous improvement. If we think about learning as a way to get where we need to be, rather than being an end in itself, we're certainly on the journey. And augmented reality offers a fantastic opportunity to embed learning into the work across all manner of enterprises and applications, and to help us learn near to the point of need, and to learn from working. And we know from research that the closer to the point that learning occurs, the closer to the point of use that learning occurs, the more impact it's likely to have. And so I think that this is opening up a whole new world for us. So Rika, can I hand back to you now so Peter can dive into some detail, some AR detail from this?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Charles. So clearly there's a lot of tremendous work and insights that the 70-20-10 Institute has been able to draw forward in terms of best practices and big practices, and certainly with regards to how we as a working society and enterprises have really tried to equip their workers to learn and optimize the performance, how all of this has been evolving over the years. And perhaps we're at a significant paradigm shift today as it relates to the technology of augmented reality, as there are certainly ways that augmented reality is here to take the performance improvement to a whole nother level. And that's where I'd like Peter for us to take us through that in terms of what augmented reality is, and at work in particular, to talk about the many opportunities that he is seeing at his role at Atheer in terms of applying augmented reality. And then we'll also talk about, of course, the critical piece around the actual journey of how to be successful with that. Just a reminder for those of you who may have just joined us, the Q&A will be at the very end. However, throughout the course of this, we will be taking questions, and Jeff, my colleague, will be recording them so that when we get to Q&A, we'll be able to take those questions first. So just a housekeeping reminder there. But now let's move to the next sections around augmented reality and the role of augmented reality in performance at work with Peter Andersson. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Rika. Thanks. Wonderful. So let's talk about the why and what of AR. And then since we are so many people from different backgrounds on the call, why don't we start by defining first what AR is? So I think in its simplest way, let's define augmented reality as the technology that brings real-time aid and expertise into your field of vision. And as we will talk about at Atheer, we also strive to make this aid intelligent. The information or expertise can be delivered on any device or operating systems, on a mobile phone, a pair of smart glasses, projected even on a windshield or any other screen, really. There are for sure a lot of eye-opening consumer apps out there, giving a flavor to everyone what AR can do, everything from home staging to navigation and so forth. And though these are useful apps, we would say that an enterprise would typically want more integrated capabilities. So let's imagine that your AR app at work knows your job role. It knows the process you're working on. It knows your experience level, your environment, what you're looking at, and can by that pull the right resources into your workflow and your field of vision. The system tracks everything that then happens and can help any organization to drive continuous improvements across work process. That's how we would like to define AR for an enterprise, and we will come back to this soon. But let's first talk about the significance of AR from a learning perspective. So next slide, please. So with the backdrop of what Charles just talked about, we've seen several technologies introduced over the past 2 decades or so that has helped us to make learning and performance becoming more or less 2 sides of the same coin. I would call this the Hall of Fame of learning technologies. What I'm highlighting here are technologies that has helped us to close the distance between learning and working. Just think about what search or online communities and forums or video streaming, instant messaging has done to provide access to knowledge, skills, people, and experiences at the point of need. And I would argue that AR is the ultimate extension of these technologies. It brings learning and work to a complete hand and glove situation. With AR, you can actually access information and expertise while performing, not right before or right after. So with that, we've covered what AR is and why the technology is so important. But I want to highlight something else as well, based on what Charles mentioned in the beginning about productivity trends in the industrial world. So next slide, please. So at Atheer, we strongly believe that AR could come handy for many professions and functions, but the deskless workers of the world is the key target group. There are about 2 billion deskless workers, what calculations estimates says, and it's a growing population, and they have traditionally been neglected, underserved, and not enough empowered by traditional or mobile computing. Next. Until now, at least, and imagine what could happen to those productivity numbers if we empower this part of the workforce, 2 billion people, with modern, up-to-date tools to better perform their jobs. And if we take a step back, I think we can all see how incredibly valuable this could be. So let me pause here and check in with Charles. Perhaps tell me, Charles, about among the companies you have been visiting, what have you seen in terms of using technologies to drive learning and where it's applied, and yeah, so what do you see companies on their journey in terms of digital transformation? If we have Charles with us.
I'm sorry, Peter. I apologize. I had myself on mute. Yeah, I think we see some big changes occurring in the way that organizations are adopting technologies and how they're integrating technologies. And I think that we're seeing it in the same way that we're seeing in consumer technology development, I guess, in that there's a lot more piloting. It's about understanding exactly, how to get it in place, building a strong business case for you, a compelling business case, and so on, to get that in place, and then making sure that you focus on the things that matter in order to succeed. We're seeing a range of technologies which are supporting all sorts of ways of which we can support people doing their work, rather than, as I was saying earlier on, supporting people away from the work. So they're the trends we're seeing generally, and it's quite important with these technologies for, if you're a learning and development professional, to make sure that you're working with your colleagues who are technology professionals in your organization to make sure that you're getting it embedded across the organization. So I think we'll see more and more of that integrated working as these new technologies come on board.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I think even the medium we are speaking through right now, using webinar as a tool for bringing people together, I think it's an excellent example, actually. Just reflected upon that. Now, I want to talk about. Thank you, Charles. I want to talk about the organization that everyone on this call represents, and in what functions of your organization can AR be applied? And I think the answer is simply almost everywhere. Although we see. Yes, thank you, Jeff. Although we see pioneers among perhaps some more industrial type of companies with manufacturing and plants, automotive, services, and so on, AR solutions are horizontal, as they can apply to almost any industry. And I want to give you a few examples of how AR can be applied, and give examples of that are more closely related to the topic of learning, as that is the topic of today. So next slide, please. And in a way, I believe that the use cases are are limitless in a way. So here I just highlight 4 of them. And let's start with the case that you just saw on a slide picture before. A car comes into a dealership. It's a 7-year-old hybrid. The service engineer has not been able to find a way to solve the problem. Instead, he's struggling, and he puts a special ticket on the car that usually prompts an expert to fly out in the field to help and solve the problem. But instead of sending an expert out in the field, the service engineer wears a pair of smart glasses and is connecting with the expert through what we call see what I see functionality. And together they are able to solve the issue. And over time, the service engineer builds his skills as he gets to be part of actually solving the problems and more difficult such. So he becomes less and less dependent on these experts as he grows his skills. So that's the first example. The second case, I think, let's flip the technology around and put a pair of smart glasses on the expert instead. In this case, it's a chef at a fast food franchise, and they've just made changes to the menu that should launch across the country at once. So the learners in this case, they are behind screens or glasses and follow the exact instructions from the chef's point of view as he prepares the dish. The third case, I think, is coming back to sort of the industrial and manufacturing aspect of this. Let's say a manufacturing and production site for airline engines. And there are a lot of standard operating procedures to follow, lots of security and safety rules, and so forth. It's not that you can do a little bit what you want and feel when walking around in a plant like that. So for this reason, AR supports something like step-by-step work instructions that helps to make sure that standard policies and practices are followed. Deploying AR makes it easier to onboard people and even make sure that those who have been long in the profession remembers all the important steps to fulfill. And the last case has more to do with the continuous learning from an organizational perspective, because if you aggregate the data and the outcome from that step-by-step work instructions, you will be able to look at patterns and trends across an organization functionally or geographically and be able to determine actions to optimize the overall performance. So I hope this makes sense, and with this as the last example, I believe, Rika, you might have a poll before discussing the AR journey.
Yes, thanks so much, Petter. Some great. Sorry, can you? I hope that's okay now that the audio was a little bit off. So no, actually, the poll will be coming towards the end. Before we talk about the AR journey, actually, what we will do is we'll just hear from Charles. So what we've been talking about here is with Charles laying out sort of the lay of the land for where learning has been in optimizing human performance and the way that it's been unfolding, and Pat, with you sharing what's been happening with the evolution of augmented reality and the way that has been coming in and materially impacting the ways that organizations can really start thinking about how they embrace AR in the various use cases. Charles, just would love to get your comments and sort of in summary as to how you think about the ways that organizations that you've been working with historically, you know, what is maybe a key hurdle that you hear about how they really embrace this in the most effective way?
Rika, I think just before I answer that, because I have some experience in that, but before I answer it, that last case that Petter talked to, in terms of organization aggregating task completion data in order to drive continuous learning, I think that's really critical, because one thing we've learned and one thing that we work on is when you look at high performers, if you're producing a high performing organization, we find that high performers are those people who execute critical tasks, and they're usually only a very few critical tasks better than their colleagues. And that, I think that drives a lot of the changes we're talking about. So if you can capture how these high performers execute these tasks, you can then make sure that that's made available to people as they use it at the point of use, you're onto a winner. But to answer your question about some of the challenges, I think there's a couple of main challenges. First of all, knowing where to start and what's going to produce this business case for you, which I mentioned earlier on. And compelling business cases are really the best instruments to help focus on what matters and where you can succeed. And so understanding and doing a good analysis to understand where you can run pilot projects. We found at the Institute that one of the best ways to get things embedded is to carry out a really good pilot project, so that you've got the data, you can then present the data to the decision makers in your organization and get it moving. And secondly, knowing how to make it happen. And I think that for here, the key element is to make sure that you work in an integrated way. You work across your organization. So you work with your IT colleagues who will be working on all sorts of technology and get them involved in the process, working with maybe your internal communications people to make sure that you can, when you have your successful business cases, when you start to get some traction, they can help you get the messages out internally to help get that change of culture. Because using approaches like AR does change the way in which learning and development works, and it moves learning and development into areas that it never worked in before. And so you have to work to a certain extent on the culture and the mindset of the organization. And it's really a move from what I was talking earlier on about, in terms of moving from focus on learning to focusing on organizational performance. So L&D becoming a value creator in the organization. So knowing where to start and knowing how to make it happen are the two key lessons that we've learned.
Yeah, exactly. So Petter, why don't you, if you can now just take us through the last portion for the webinar around how we're seeing that level of readiness that Charles was just talking about, as well as how we might be able to pave that path forward and help organizations navigate the way to effectively embrace AR to benefit the most from it.
Right. Absolutely. I'll do that. And so I see it. I mean, we talked through the why, we talked through the what, and so let's talk a little bit about how now. And so if we can move to next slide and just yeah, do we have another slide coming? There we are. Okay. Perfect. All right. Yeah. So I just wanted to start high level, and as is the case for any new technology coming to market, there is a certain adoption curve from the companies that are true pioneers all the way to the laggards. And here is an IDC report from January this year, which is sort of actually quite a long time ago, if we think about the speed of the evolution here. But it tells us that about 40% of companies had not done anything at all involving AR at this stage when the survey was done. On the other hand, that means that 60% of companies had actually started to explore and test AR. All only around 3% are into full deployment. So this picture confirms what we believe at Atheer. Things are moving, but we are still in a very early stage of this industry. And now, if I would be embarking on an AR journey with my organization, what is then the path of success? How do I take a step-by-step approach without investing too much until I know what will be the best case for deployment? So next slide, please. To facilitate such a journey, we designed a pathway to success that we believe could be useful. We divide it into three main phases. You need, as an organization, to understand and ideate, understand what AR technology can do, explore some industry examples, and so on and so forth. And at the end of this first phase, basically the outcome is that you narrow down on the list of opportunities that you want to continue and move ahead with. So among all the options, what are the most urgent ones or most likely to succeed? And then you take it from there. Then what we would say is that you move into a phase of experimentation and design. And again, it's important here to sort of paint or set the scope and the roadmap right, and create a baseline for your business case before you move into more expensive design and development. And perhaps you'd run a pilot here in this early phase. A lot of our customers certainly do that early on in order to sort of get familiarized with the technology and what it can do, and also test the waters a little bit with the users. So that's what we recommend. And obviously then you have a deployment phase that has a lot of the traditional change components to it and so forth. So with that, feel free to use this model as you move ahead, and let us know what we can support with. I think we certainly think that we can provide anything from support in terms of understanding what AR technology can do, pull together some great examples from the market, help you to define your business case for success, run a pilot or experimenting with the design, all the way to deployment. So let us know. And with that, I think we are closing in on time, and time for questions soon. So at this stage, I would like to hand over back to you, Rika.
Okay. All right. Yes, we have quite a few folks on the webinar, which is wonderful, and we'll be moving over to Q&A in a moment. Just to summarize what we talked about today, hearing from Charles and Petter with their respective work that they've been doing in this field for the past several years, and the ways that the industry itself has been continuing to evolve. Obviously, learning and working will continue to converge. The symbiotic relationship between the application of what you learn and then what you learn from the work applying back to the craft and the work at hand. Second, augmented reality is not just a blip on the screen. The technology of AR is the next computing paradigm, and something that's a natural follow-on to how digital transformation has continued to essentially not just disrupt, but also benefit and improve the ways that enterprises continue to drive productivity in their organizations. And the bottom line, augmented reality is really one of the next waves around that. That's a natural outcome of computing. And in fact, if anything, AR will prove how it closes the gap between working and learning. And then in terms of the low-hanging fruit, in terms of where AR will manifest the greatest benefits in the short term, is going to be with the deskless worker, which today is the majority of workers around the world, and is perhaps the most underserved group around the world as it relates to digital transformation and new technologies. And with AR, this cohort of the deskless workers will really be able to drive tremendous amounts of gain for the enterprise and the organizations. So what we'd like to do before we move to Q&A is to have another poll. So for those of you who joined us later in the session today, we kicked off the session earlier with one poll, and this is poll number 2. It's always great to know where participants are in the AR landscape and the map. So Jeff, if you could just go to the poll. So in your organization, how would you rate your leaders' awareness about the full potential of AR? So this can be at the executive level, or could be within your business unit. It's really about understanding and getting some insights for everybody here where leaders' awareness is around the full potential of AR. So either there's limited AR awareness overall, a few leaders have taken the lead and awareness is spreading, or a majority of your leaders seem clear about the potential of AR and the impact on learning and human performance. Or you have a clear AR strategy and it's being fully embraced. So let's just give folks a couple of seconds to click one of those. And Jeff, please let me know if we have the results to share it with the audience. All right, so it seems predominantly there's limited AR awareness. which is a great opportunity for those of us who are in the space and can see the results that AR is yielding and bring that to the table. And then seems a few leaders have taken the lead and awareness is spreading. And then third, a majority of leaders seem clear about the potential. But the great news is 10% of the 75 or so folks who are on the call today say that there's a clear AR strategy and it's being fully embraced, which is awesome and tremendous. Okay, so let's talk about next steps. Petter, why don't you go ahead and talk about what are the next steps, and then again, please, for those of you who have questions, please ask them through the chat, and we'll address them when we go to Q&A. Go ahead, Petter.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Rika. So we just have some, I think, final recommendations here for those of you who are in the very beginning, early stages of exploring AR and so forth. So if you can just pull up that final slide, the next one. Yeah, so really what we say here that, you know, we encourage you all to start to think about AR now. I think it's important as you see this, I think this trend and evolution of the industry or of this technology is happening now. So start experimenting and looking at the IDC numbers earlier. If you don't experiment right now, be sure your competitors are, because a lot are in the early innings of their putting their thoughts together around this. Second recommendation would be not to boil the ocean. Start small, focus on one area of your organization, one process, prove your case, and then go from there. Many of us that comes from the learning world have experienced large, ambitious learning projects that sometimes have missed the mark and never shown real ROI. The good thing about AR though is that it often supports processes with easy measurable metrics. Still though, we have to be cautious. And finally, we, Atheer, Charles and the team at 70-20-10 are here to help. Let us know. In fact, we do have some pretty exciting ideas around learning in AR, knowing what is happening also with AR technology. And we would love to explore those ideas with organizations of size. So if you're interested, please let us know by the email addresses below, and let's go and win some awards together. So with that, over to you, Rika, and see if we have any questions coming in.
Sure. And as we go through the questions, Charles or Petter, we can have either of you or both of you respond as it's related to your area. So sure. The first question is, does AR include auditory?
Right. So I assume that this has to do with sort of the voice recognition and so forth, and yes, it does, and it all comes down sort of to the form factor. And I haven't spent a lot of time talking about what AR technology can do in detail on this call, also because there are so many moving parts. But of course, we Atheer, and as we talked about, sort of the need for enterprise AR to be much more sophisticated and integrated. It comes with those kind of needs. You need to be able to cater for people who are in a noisy environment. So we work with hand gestures. We need to be able to cater for people who need their hands to perform some work. So we work with voice recognition and voice activated commands and so forth. So it's all there, and if you're interested, again, you know, let us know, and we will take you through where we are in terms of both the patents that we have produced around these areas, as well as the standards that we are working on or working with.
Okay, great. Second question, will the session be available online? I will go ahead and answer that. Yes, we will be publishing the recording and sending it out to the group, and welcome anybody to spread the love of what we've been doing and spread the link for other folks to be able to benefit from the session today. Third question, how do you walk a client through ROI? Which key metrics do you focus on and guide the client to uncover the key areas for optimization?
Rika, can I pick that up just to start?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a good question. And the answer is pretty simple, really. You understand what the burning bridges are that the client has, and what are the key metrics that the client uses. We've worked with big in factories, particularly, where it was really clear, what were the challenges were: high error rates, failures, task completion was lower than expected. We were using productivity measures. So if you can identify productivity measures and then use those as metrics to apply your AR solutions and get your data in terms of increased productivity and so on, that makes the compelling business case really quite straightforward. In fact, the Institute, we work with the world's largest dairy cooperative, in fact, in some of their factories. And they had a major challenge in terms of shutdowns in the factory. And using our methodology and using really smart technology, we found that just in one factory alone, after running a pilot, the factory was saving $50,000 a week just from productivity increases. So in terms of ROI, it's pretty straightforward. Peter mentioned earlier on that a lot of the requirements for activity measures, how many people have been on a course, how many people have completed a course, those sorts of things are not relevant. Once we move learning into the workplace, the metrics you're using are your stakeholder metrics. It also helps you prove the value to your stakeholder, and the stakeholder will have a much higher regard if you run a pilot and you can demonstrate using their metrics that you've shown an improvement. It almost becomes a no-brainer. I was Chief Learning Officer for Reuters and Thomson Reuters, and I can recall sitting with a senior global leader when we'd trialed a new technology, and the IT department were not so sure that it was going to fit with the IT policy, and he turned to his project manager and said, "What happens if we don't use that?" And she simply said, "We go back to using what we're doing now." And he said, "No question." So I think that you just think about what the stakeholder metrics are and you drive it from there.
And I can just echo what you said, Charles. I think that the good news is that a lot of those metrics are already in place, because there are typical productivity measures that is already embedded in the way you go about measuring your business. So in addition to that, you look at productivity gains and so forth, but you also look at the cost that you avoid by, for instance, having shutdowns in a factory and the time it takes to power up again after a disruption of some sort. You look at cost avoidance in terms of expert being sent out in the field, cost avoidance in terms of shipping equipment from one place to another, but being able to rather than fix the problem where it is at the time, and so forth. So those are just a few examples, but I agree, it's pretty straightforward. Yet, that said, I think it's one of the biggest sort of barriers that people have to align around a business case. And I think that's sort of part of that first phase of coming together and agreeing what is important and narrowing down the number of opportunities you have with AR is to really agree on what business case to go after.
Okay, thanks so much, Peter and Charles. Fourth question is, what are the biggest barriers to adoption? I think the question has to do more on the technical side. We identified one of the barriers being around organizations truly understanding what it takes and how the journey to uncovering the benefits from AR can be very measured. I think the question here is more around technical, like the follow-up, is it the displays, is it the problem with offline data, etc. So maybe, Peter, you can pick that one up.
Yeah, sure. Well, so one of the things that we constantly, of course, trying to achieve here is to make sure that our platform, for instance, is available across any kind of devices, operating systems, and technologies available, which should make it more seamless in terms of experience if you are deploying AR in your organization. Now, we do have, and we recognize, of course, that again, we are in a very early stage of this of AR being deployed as a technology. So hardware is an issue in terms of form factor and what it can do, especially if we talk about smart glasses, for instance. I think, you know, what we still have to realize though is that, you know, there are 5 billion people with smartphones in their pockets. And smartphone is a fantastic instrument to deploy AR through. But for the more of those industrial applications where we picture people wearing things on their head, it's still a little bit of maturity that is happening in that space in order to get the form factors right. Battery lifetime, for instance, and of course the visuals of having a screen in your vision, in your field of vision, and so forth. So there is a lot still to evolve in that area. But I mean, I just compare to mobile internet and the evolution of telecommunication, since I've been in that industry for 70 years, and you know, we used to walk around with big mobile phones, even barely carrying them around with battery packs and everything to still use the service. So and look where we are today. So I think we will look back in a couple of years' time and probably laugh at the smart glasses we have available today, but it will all be good at the end.
It will all be good at the end. Okay, so I think the last question that we have today is the names of the presenters. Maybe Jeff, the organizer, if you could just flash to the slide that had Petter and Charles's information on there and their Twitter handle, and you'll be able to reach out as well. You know, we will follow up with the information as well to everybody here with the emails and the contact information. So, but we are towards the end of the hour. It's been a wonderful session with you, Charles, Petter. Thank you so much for taking the time. Okay, well, that wraps it up for us today. Again, thank you for joining our session on superpowering human performance using augmented reality. And if you have any further questions, we'll be reaching out with a link to the recording, and feel free to follow with us from there. And good luck to all of you on this incredible journey that we're on, and really making the various organizations and enterprises that we're in or with whom we work take advantage of new technologies for human performance today. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day, afternoon, and evening. Bye-bye.